First of all, Jane and I are absolutely delighted to be here today. Thank you very much for having us. What we're going to talk about is an item of clothing that we have at the Museum of London. You can see it on the screen here. It was given to us in 1924 by Mr. and Mrs. Macawa, and it came with a note that said that it had been worn by King Charles I when he was executed in 1649. There is some documentary evidence that the king put on an extra shirt on the day because it was in January. He didn't want to shiver. He didn't want people to think that he was afraid. So there is some evidence that he said to someone, "Can I have another shirt?" Now, we actually call this a waistcoat. It was early on this type of garment, which is basically an undergarment worn for warmth. Was called a petticoat, but as you can see here, these are some excerpts from Charles I wardrobe inventories, that he had several knitted waistcoats in his inventory, so we have documentary evidence for that. There is also some evidence that Charles II had these knitted waistcoats, so they were popular throughout the 17th century. The provenance for Charles I's shirt is a little bit dodgy in the early stages. It also points a little bit more towards Charles II, but we still haven't totally confirmed which king it was. We undertook we're still sort of working on this project. We've been working on and off, not full time sadly, for the last 3 or so years. And it was prompted by an exhibition about the executions which we had at our museum in Docklands. And the shirt, or waistcoat rather, will also go on display when the Museum of London, which is currently closed, will reopen as the London Museum in 2026. So what we want to do, what we wanted to do with the project is it's an iconic object for the Museum of London. You know, when we talk about our star objects, it always comes up. So we wanted to just find out more about it because research had been done over the years, but it hadn't sort of all been brought together and consolidated. We also wanted to use something that Jane is sort of very familiar with and has done a lot of work on, is sort of use more recent ways of scientific analysis of textiles. This project also has a reconstruction component, but we're not going to talk about that today. But if you want to know about that, please ask us. And one thing we haven't totally achieved yet, we were thinking about a podcast at some point. We also wanted to find ways of sort of communicating this to a wider audience.
So when we decided that we would look at the object itself and not worry too much about whether it really was associated with King Charles I or King Charles II, there were a lot of research areas that we thought would be of interest because very little actual study of the object had been done. So we mapped out all the research variables we could look at and then decided to focus on particular areas. And today we're going to be looking particularly at the colour and how we investigated that. We're pretty sure it is silk, although at the beginning we weren't entirely sure. And also, Beatrice has already alluded to the fact that there's an issue of terminology around this particular kind of garment in the 17th century. One of the other issues that we will focus on today is trying to find out where it comes from, because it has no clear provenance other than this odd story about it being associated with the execution of Charles I. We do know a bit about how these waistcoats were worn from contemporary sources. Here we've got from the end of the 16th century and the end of the 17th century information that tells us they were worn over the shirt and under the doublet or jacket, so a sort of inter layer of clothing, as Beatrice said, for warmth and for comfort. Around 1600, these garments seem to have moved from being very plain, because they were essentially undercover most of the time, not outerwear, to being much, much more sophisticated and fancy in their composition. And this is just one indication from London by John Stowe, who is not always a reliable witness, but he says that waistcoats became much more sophisticated around that period. And in fact, if we look at the corpus of extant waistcoats that are in museums all over the world, they can be categorised into two particular types: the brocade, which are the fancier of the two categories, or the damask. And our waistcoat at the Museum of London is an example of the damask style of waistcoat. Here are a couple of cousins to our waistcoat, which is the one in the middle. They look very similar on first glance, particularly the colour, which we will come to. But in fact, as there has been very little scholarship published on these knitted waistcoats at all, it's interesting to speculate on what we can learn from detailed examination of the fibre and the style of its patterning, etc. The thing they do have in common is that we do know they are all made of silk. The one on the right does have metalwork embroidery as well.
So you will all know very well that there's been an enormous amount of publications about silk in the last few years, but over the last 150 or so years even. And here just a very, very sort of small sample of it. And but what is sort of, and we know a lot about silk being processed in various different places, particularly in Italy. There's a lot of information about that because of the amazing documents that have survived there. But most of the time when people talk about silk, and it's not almost even ever spelled out, they don't say silk fabric, but most of the time it's woven fabric that people talk about. So the other things that are made of silk, we know it was one for embroidery, used for embroidery, for braiding, for other things, and also for knitting. That is often something that is missing. So again, just to sort of make that point again, so we know a lot about the move of raw silk from China and then later on from other places sort of around the world, and we know about it being processed in different places. And but quite often there's also a sort of terminology thing. Sometimes when something is just called silk, as I said earlier, usually people talk about the fabric and not about something else. This is just to show you that sort of raw silk was imported into England. This is from the late 17th century from various places, as you can see. So we can sort of see that in the sort of customs document. And I'm sure you're very familiar with this. There are also a lot of treatises to try and sort of distribute knowledge about the manufacture of the actual silk thread. So there are various, this is one from the Netherlands, sort of showing the feeding of the worms, and to the reeling. And then these are from two different tracts from Germany. Again, the same kind of thing, the worms, the reeling to getting to the sort of silk thread, and the throwing or twisting, which is then required. But usually this is all to make silk fabric. So there's a lot of talk about that the warps and the wefts have to be twisted in a different way, but no one seems to say, but if you want to knit, this is what you would have to do with the silk to make it right for that. We also know quite a bit about, well, not an awful amount, but we know a little bit about people involved in the trade. So quite often, as you will know, knowledge, despite people writing these treatises to show how things were done, knowledge usually moved around with people. So you can see here quite a lot of people coming from Burgundy or from the Netherlands to England and bringing their knowledge with them on of how to make sort of silk thread. And we particularly know about silk women in the 16th and 17th century. They were selling, they were either involved in the throwing or spinning of silk, or they were selling various kinds of silk products. On the left, they're actually complaining about foreigners coming in and messing with their trade. And on the right-hand side, there is something about all the wonderful things that you can get at Cheapside, which is a street in London, which is very, very near where the museum is at the moment. And as an interesting aside, the people who gave us the waistcoat, Mr. and Mrs. Macawa, they were actually silk merchants, and they had right at Cheapside a silk shop.
So we know a little bit about the knitting of garments in the 16th and the 17th century from a variety of different documentary sources. Here you can see examples of petticoats mentioned in legislation in the 16th century, but also we have wardrobe accounts and inventories that tell us who owned and wore these sorts of garments. But most interestingly, from 1562, there's a book of rates which gives the rateable value for imported petticoats knit of silk. But unfortunately, we don't actually know where they were imported from. We know a little bit about knitters, and it really is fragmentary. We have an imperfect picture of all of the elements of this processing of silk into knitted garments. These are two of the very few representations of people actually knitting in the early modern period. And examples, again, of immigrants to London who are described in a census as knitters. And here we can see they're not knitting waistcoats, they're knitting headwear and sleeves. These are the most famous representations of knitters in an earlier period, the knitting Madonnas. And it's very interesting that these earliest representations of knitting are actually of the Virgin Mary knitting waistcoats.
Oh, yeah. So one thing we wanted to sort of find out more about is where they, as we keep saying, is sort of where they actually came from. And traditionally, they have been seen as coming from Italian. So if you look them up on all the different websites, they often say Italy ? Or people seem to be quite certain that they come from Italy. But we know that in other places, waistcoat had to be knitted by journeymen, for instance. So here's some example talking about the knitters in France, but also in Prague, having to knit this kind of garment. So we definitely know they were worn in Italy, but we think it's not totally clear that they definitely were made there. Another avenue that I hope someone here knows a little bit more about. These are actually two separate waistcoats, they're not the same. And one is from Scotland, one is in Scotland, one is in Stockholm, and they both have these wax seals. And if you could go to the next one. So these are the two different seals, and the left one you can still see a little bit more. To me it always looks a little bit like a beehive, but I'm not sure. They might be the same, they might not be the same. The right one is a bit too degraded to say for sure. But we hope that looking into this a bit more, that we maybe find out where they might have come from. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were made where they came from. A lot of you will be aware of cloth seals that were put on fabrics, lead cloth seals. We have a lot of these in the collection at the Museum of London, and many places have them. But wax seals are a bit more rare. They don't seem to be used that much, and they don't seem to be written about that much. But would be very happy to be corrected about that.
So there has been some work done on the categorization of woven silk fabrics in terms of their patterning or motifs. And one of the most famous motifs, which comes up again and again in secondary sources, is the use of the pomegranate motif, which you can see here has been analysed in 3 different groups in a work from the 1990s. You can actually, in some of the brocade waistcoats, which make up the larger number amongst the extant ones in museums, you can actually find examples of this pomegranate motif repeated, not as uniformly as it is in woven fabrics, but in knitted fabrics, as you can see here. And this suggests that the knitted waistcoats are, to a certain extent, trying to mimic the same Eastern motifs that woven fabric used. These are the 2 waistcoats that we've been able to look at in detail at Drummond Castle and our own waistcoat at the Museum of London. They have different sections in them, the yoke and the welts and the main body. And the Museum of London waistcoat has been studied before. Unfortunately, these grids aren't actually entirely accurate, and it did take us a reconstruction to figure out that they weren't a precise reconstruction of the motifs in it. We found reconstruction to be an extremely useful research methodology. If we look closely at the main body part of our waistcoat, you can look at it in one of 2 ways. You can either see the pomegranate motif, or you can see what has been called the tree of life motif. And I think it rather depends how your eyes work, which one of these you see first when you look at the fabric. Now, the other motif, which is seen in the Drummond Castle waistcoat, is the 8-pointed star, which of course has a long heritage in other cultures. But it has become a typical and very characteristic motif of Scandinavian knitting, not only in the 16th and 17th century, but right through to folk dress in the 19th century, and it continues today as a very popular motif for modern knitting designs. And in fact, a Danish knitting designer has categorised the types of stars that are used in modern knitting and other elements of the patterning in the knitting. Now, it's interesting to think of these as being relatively typical for Scandinavia, but we can see here on the left a late 16th century pattern used for all kinds of needlework, which was published in a German, by a German publisher, which uses the star motif. Here you can see the main body of the Drummond Castle waistcoat, and here are the 8-pointed stars, which are so typical today of Scandinavian knitting. Also, the crosshatch of diagonal lines, which is repeated on a lot of extant damask knitted waistcoats. These are even earlier pattern books published in Germany from 1529, which show that these were popular throughout Europe and are maybe not originally Scandinavian. If we compare the patterns we have in the two waistcoats we've studied in detail with two waistcoats which are said to be Italian and still in an Italian collection, we can see that they have very different kind of stylized motifs, nothing like the ones that we have in our two waistcoats.
And so last part, we want to say a few words about dye. So the waistcoats, they're about like 55 to 65. We might not have discovered all of them around in the entire world. And they have very different colors. Some are bright yellow, some are green, purple, our color. And the ones on the left are two that are associated with William III. And as we know, silk takes dye really, really well. So they really have sort of very, very sort of deep colors, a lot of them. This color, so ours again is the one in the center, is relatively rare. There's only a few, one more definitely, that has this particular color. But if you look at it very closely, you see it is actually not quite a uniform color. And I'm not even talking about the stains. Ours has stains, and that's a whole other story, seeing its supposed history. But if you look very closely, you can see that some of the fibers look very, very blue. Some look a bit more yellow, some don't look dyed at all. And on the right, you can see us sort of trying to be a bit more objective about how we actually talk about the actual color. And you will notice I don't actually say what I think the color is. So the other method we wanted to use, and we were very fortunate to work with the laboratory here and with Paolo, who's here today. So we asked for sampling permission, which at the Museum of London is rather a long process, but we were granted it. You don't need much, but you actually do need to snip it off, which was terrifying. But there were a lot of ends inside the waistcoat, so we snipped off a lot to be able to bring it here, also from the Drummond Castle one.
So I can't do justice to the methods that we used. Paula, who, as Beatrice said, is here among us, actually did the hard work with one of her students to use 4 different dye analysis techniques, which Beatrice and I were very fortunate to come to Paula's lab and learn how those methods are used. And that was really very helpful in terms of fostering interdisciplinary work. We found that collaboration incredibly fruitful. As I say, we can't pretend to know the ins and outs of all of these, but we do know that there's a protocol as to which methods you use at which time, because the final method, which gives you a very useful result, is actually a destructive method, and that's the HPLC method. We got results which were very interesting. We know that the Museum of London and the Drummond Castle both have evidence of being dyed with indigo. But interestingly, the Drummond Castle also has evidence of having been dyed with a yellow dye, flax-leaved daphne, which is native to Mediterranean areas. And so now we are wondering whether detailed dye analysis and investigation of dye stuffs might help us understand the origin of the waistcoats, whether they were knitted where the dye stuffs were available or whether the dye stuffs were taken to where the waistcoats were made. It'll be another interesting avenue of inquiry.
Just to say that we've been really fortunate to work with a whole lot of people. So just like many, many different skills would have been put in to make the final result, the waistcoat, many, many skills now are needed to extract all the information from it. And as you hear, there's still a lot of known unknowns and probably a few unknown unknowns as well. So we'd like to thank all the collaborators that we've worked with so far. We can send that to you if you're interested. It's a bibliography. And we would also like to thank the project has been funded by several organizations, and including the Makawa family, the descendants of the original donors of the object. And we would like to thank you too for listening.